Hello, I'm Jack Grady, and on behalf of the Archives and History Committee of the First Baptist Church on the Square in LaGrange, Georgia, we welcome World War II veteran Margaret Stephens, and we thank her for her service to our country and to our church. Margaret is a member of our senior adult choir here, and we are pleased about that and appreciate her service. Margaret, thank you so much for your willingness to come and share a few of the highlights of your career in the Women's Army Corps.
Thank you.
Thank you
For inviting me.
First of all, tell us a little bit about your enlistment process.
In 1942, I began wondering whether I could be a veteran. I had no brothers, and I was thinking about my parents because my father was ill, and I wondered if there was some way I could help financially, and I happened to think that I could be a member of the Women's Army Corps.
Yes.
And there would be a little financial help from what I would earn, which at that time was $50 a month.
Okay, that was the pay for.
That was the pay for
member of the Women's Army Corps. WAC, we call WACs. The WACs, yes.
The WACs.
Yes. I don't know whether that was an appropriate term or not, but anyway, it described it.
It just means Women's Army Corps.
Yes, right. And tell us a little bit about your basic training experience.
After I left Scranton, Pennsylvania on the
You grew
train.
up in Scranton, Pennsylvania?
Yes, I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
I was
Okay.
born in Scranton, Pennsylvania. When I left there on a train, we went to Daytona Beach, Florida, where I had my basic training. I don't remember a great deal about it, but I do remember that we trained and drilled on the beach.
Oh, on the beach. You did some drilling, just
On the beach, yes.
like any other group of soldiers.
Yes.
Did basic training.
I don't think it was as strenuous as the men's Army Corps, but the men's Army. But I enjoyed that we were learning to march.
Yes.
And to keep in step.
Sure.
It was interesting.
Yeah, I'm sure. Was it like 6, 8, 10 weeks?
I think 8 weeks.
About 8 weeks of basic training. And as you think back, what was the most challenging thing that you faced during your basic training program?
Leaving home.
Oh, leaving home, being away from home for the first time, I guess.
Yes. Being away from home.
Yes, and that Daytona Beach is a good ways from
Scranton,
Pennsylvania. Yes. Okay, and then what happened after basic training?
After basic training, I was my orders called for clerk school. I went to clerk school.
Secretarial work.
At a secretarial kind of thing. That's what I had requested when I enlisted.
Yes.
And I finished that course, and then my orders sent me to Fort McClellan, Alabama.
Oh, yes.
At Anniston. And
I
was assigned to the hospital. Now, that was because I had had some training in nursing.
Okay.
And I was assigned to the contagion ward, and that's where I remained.
My goodness. That was a large base, Army base at that time, wasn't it? Huge base.
The station hospital, and I believe the number was 106 at Fort McClellan.
And then, did you spend your entire service time there at Fort McClellan?
I spent my entire service time at Fort McClellan. That would be from 44 to the end of 45, till October of 45.
But you were inducted in 1943, weren't you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and then basic training, clerk school, and
All right.
into the hospital.
Yes. Did you ever think that you might be assigned to an overseas post, or was that
At one point
in the discussion?
during my service at Fort McClellan, early in Fort McClellan, I got some orders to go to, I don't know whether it was Europe or the South Pacific. They asked me if I wanted to go, and I said, well, I'm sorry, I'd like to go, but my father is very sick and maybe at the point of death. And I'd rather not be out of the States
Sure.
at that
Yes,
time.
that's certainly understandable.
They just told me that they would just wait. So that's what they did. So I never went overseas.
Yes, okay. But you worked there at the hospital
Yes.
in Fort McClellan.
Fort McClellan.
Yes. Okay. What are some of the memories you have of that experience?
Well, I worked with mumps.
Mumps?
Mumps.
Was that prevalent among the soldiers?
Yes, it was.
A lot
For men who were coming back from the South Pacific,
Okay, I see.
and some from Europe.
And they sent them to Fort McClellan.
They sent them to Fort McClellan. And another, I can't remember what I want to say now. But anyway, mumps, any contagious disease,
Yes.
was assigned to the contagion ward at Fort McClellan. I stayed there until sometime in 1944. My father died, and when I returned to Fort McClellan, my orders assigned me to a psychotic ward, and I was to special, a civilian woman. I was exasperated.
I guess so.
I thought, why am I assigned to a civilian woman who is psychotic when...
I mean, she was your patient.
She was the patient.
But she was a civilian.
She was a civilian. And she lived in Anniston.
Oh.
I don't know whether her husband was a soldier at the fort or whether he was overseas. I do not know that.
Yes.
But she was a civilian woman, and I was mad. And but anyway, I did what I was told,
Yes.
what I was ordered to do, and that's where I stayed until the woman was sent home, I guess, or
see.
I don't know what really.
Graduated from that program, whatever.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, I guess that was a challenging
It was very
responsibility.
challenging because my father had just died, and
Sure.
I was still grieving.
Oh, my. Yes. And here you had this unusual assignment.
Yes.
Not in your expectations, I'm sure, of being
being
an army nurse. Here you were attending to a civilian.
Oh dear, that was very devastating to me.
But you worked with other patients as well.
Yes,
over time.
well, I worked with mumps, and I can't think of what the other...
Any tuberculosis cases coming from overseas?
Tuberculosis, but
Psychiatry, of course, you mentioned the
Yes.
psychiatric area.
but anyway, that's where I was assigned anyway.
Okay.
And they reassigned me to
Yes.
a psychotic ward.
Did you live on base or in the
Yes,
barracks?
I lived in the barracks.
In the barracks?
Yes.
And by that time, you had advanced some, probably, in your rank, your
Yes. I went from private to corporal.
You were
And
corporal.
that's as far as I went.
Yeah, good.
Tech corporal.
Tech corporal. All right. What would you say would be the most memorable experience from those days when you were at the hospital there?
I guess you would say meeting my husband, my future husband.
Sounds interesting. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was a child, I used to say to myself, when I get married, I'm going to marry a man with black hair, sideburns, and a mustache.
Okay.
Well, at Fort McClellan in the psychiatric ward, one night, another whack was standing in the kitchen. They were just gathered together, and they were just talking. And they were talking about Steve. They kept saying, Steve will be coming back. And, we'll be so glad to see him and all that. I said, finally I spoke up and said, who's Steve?
Who is Steve? Yeah.
And they looked at me as if, goodness, don't you know Steve? And I said I didn't know him, and they told me then that I would like him. And so, some days later, this man came walking through the ward, and I had never seen him before, and he had black hair, sideburns, and a mustache.
Fit your description to a T. Oh, boy.
And my thought was, that's for me. And then later, I met Sergeant Stevens, and
he was a sergeant.
he was a sergeant, he was a tech sergeant.
He was assigned to that hospital.
Yes.
Oh, okay, and had been for some.
Yes, he'd been
before
there.
you came.
I think he had been assigned there when he came back from the South Pacific.
He had been in the South Pacific.
He'd been there as long as he'd been in the service after basic, I think.
Well,
Anyway.
excuse me. Tell me a little bit about him. I mean, about his military career.
Well, he, I don't remember a great deal about it, except that he went to the South Pacific after basic training. And
Assigned to one of those islands, I guess.
Yes, and he came back rather confused, I think, because somebody was in the PX one day, and now this is what Steve told me. I knew him as Steve. His first name was Marvin.
Marvin Stephens.
But I knew him as Steve until I got out of the service. But anyway, he was sitting drinking a glass of something, and he spilled it all over because something happened that got his attention, and he spilled it all over. And he attributed that to the fact that he had been in the South Pacific and things were not as normal as they were in the United States. So, but I never felt that kind of.
And he had responsibilities there at the hospital.
Yes, well, he had worked as the tech sergeant there on that ward. Anyway, he asked me for a date finally, and
did you say finally?
finally. Well, I don't know how long between the times having seen him the first time, and we had our first date in Oxford, Alabama, which is next door to Anniston.
Yes.
And we got a hamburger.
You remember that well?
I remember that well.
Okay.
And 6 months later, we were married in the station hospital chapel.
You were still there at the hospital, both of you, still assigned to the Fort McClellan Hospital.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Then, after we were married, we lived in Anniston in an apartment. And Steve wanted me out of the service. He was getting out, and he wanted me out. And the only way I could get out was on his discharge.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't know that it worked that way.
That's the way I got out. And so I was discharged at Fort Bragg.
Oh, okay.
I had to go to Fort Bragg.
Well, this was in 1945? 1945.
And I think it took a while. I think it started like in July, and it took a while. I was discharged in October.
Which was right after the Japanese had surrendered.
That's right.
Of course, in May, I believe, that year,
Yes.
the Germans had surrendered in Europe.
Yes.
Now, in August, the Japanese surrendered. The surrender ceremony must have been in early September, and then you were discharged right after that.
That's right, right after that.
So you were there for, as they used to say, for the duration of the war.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Well, and then it was time for you to go home, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, I guess.
Establish your new home.
Yes.
And where did you go from there?
From there, we went back to LaGrange, Georgia. Steve, before the war, had worked in Dixie Mill Manufacturing Company.
Dunson
No,
Mill?
not Dunson.
Oh, no.
Dixie.
Oh, Dixon.
Dixie
Mill.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
And when he was drafted, or when he was assigned to be drafted, he went to Mr. Wharton, who was the superintendent of Dixie Mill at that time, and told him that he had received his draft notice. And Mr. Wharton said, "Well, do you want to go?" And he said, "Well, yes, I do." And so Mr. Wharton said, "All right, then when you come back, your job will be waiting for you if you want it." Well, he was married, so he had to have something to sustain us with.
So was LaGrange his home?
He was born in Pike County, Alabama.
Okay, but he was here to work.
But he lived with his sister in LaGrange.
And worked in Dixie Mill. Now I understand, yes. Okay.
And we were married for 51 years before
51
he died.
years,
Yes.
great. Good for you.
Yes.
Well, so LaGrange has been your home
Ever since.
all that period of time.
Yes.
Yes.
Ever since.
Yes. And you have some family?
I had one sister. Her name was Jean, and she lived, she was a missionary to Japan.
Really?
And she stayed in Japan for 25 years. She was married in Japan to a Presbyterian minister, and they came back to the States because he had had a stroke and had to be brought home by air transport. And they lived in New York until his recovery, and went to Stony Point, New York to live after that. I only had one sister, no brothers. I guess I've already said that's why I really
You felt the need to enlist in the Army because you had no brothers.
Yes.
And you wanted to serve your country during that period of time. Well, that's certainly a wonderful attitude for you to have, and we appreciate it so much. Were there any other people in your family that served in World War II? Probably. You said you had no brothers, of course. I remember that.
Let me see. I had.
What about Steve or Marvin? Marvin Stephens, your husband.
At that time, no.
Okay.
But later, in the Korean War and in Vietnam,
I see.
my caregiver, as I call her, Louise Morris, Louise Bonner, had 3 brothers. And 2 of them, one was in Korea and lost his life in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And she had 2 brothers that served in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them are still alive.
Wow. So all 3 of them served overseas
Yes.
in combat.
Mm-hmm.
In combat. Well, Margaret, it's just been a delight to sit and talk with you about your Army experience.
Well, thank you.
And you were discharged then as a corporal?
Yes.
Tech corporal,
Yes,
I
tech
believe you
corporal.
called it. And your husband was discharged as a sergeant,
Yes.
tech sergeant,
Tech
I
sergeant.
believe he was. And you've lived most of your life here in LaGrange, Georgia.
Yes.
Well, I want to tell you that we are pleased that you're a part of our Merrymakers organization here in our church, and that you are an important member of our senior adult choir. We thank you for that.
Thank you.
We also thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you. I want to tell you that I am a member at Second Baptist
Yes.
Church. And
Yes.
Second Baptist Church is an offspring of First Baptist
First
Church.
Baptist, yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for bringing that out. Good.
Yes.
But you're actually involved in both
I think-
churches.
yes, I'm very involved at Second Baptist. I
Yes.
have been for many, many years.
Yes.
Yes. When I grew up, I was christened in the Congregational Church.
Oh,
So I
okay.
thought I was a Christian.
Yes.
I didn't realize that for many, many, many years. And then I became a Baptist,
Mhm.
and suddenly I realized that I was not a Christian when all through the war,
Yes.
and I realized then, late in life really, that I was not a Christian.
You had to
And
personally
Yes,
make that
I
profession of
I
faith.
had no personal experience with the Lord at all. And that was, now I grew up going to Sunday school from the time I was a baby,
Okay.
from the time I was a baby. But it's only after I was 20, now let's see, in my 20s, late 20s,
Yes.
that I realized in 1952,
Oh, you remember the year well.
yes, when I joined
Yes.
a Second Baptist Church,
I see. Okay.
all of a sudden, I suddenly realized that.
Yes. A revelation.
Yes.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's an interesting personal story.
Oh, well.
And a very meaningful one, I know, to you.
It is for me,
Yes.
yes.
And we appreciate your sharing it with us.
And I love the South.
Love the South.
I'm not,
good.
a Yankee any longer.
Okay.
Not born like
Yes.
born.
Well, Tech Corporal Margaret Stephens, thank you again.
Thank you
being
for
here.
having me.
Yes, thank you. And best wishes to you in the
Thank
days
you.
ahead.
Thank you.